Greetings and welcome back to 303 and Junior English. We turn now in your hymnals to page 1062, 1063 and following. We're going to introduce ourselves to a true genius of poetic works, Gwendolyn Brooks. You can see the dates there of 1917 to 2000, so just recently passed. We're going to be looking at her text, The Explorer. Let's start with some background information, though, to start with, and the biographic information. I'm with you on 1063. Just read with me. Gwendolyn Brooks was raised in a Chicago neighborhood known as Bronzeville, the setting for her first book, A Street in Bronzeville, 1945. Although her early poems focus on struggling urban blacks who feel uprooted and are unable to make a living, Brooks's own youth was quite different. Her home was warm, her family loving, supportive, and confident that Brooks would find success as a writer. Brooks began writing poetry at the age of 7. Her first published poem, Eventide, appeared in American Childhood magazine in 1930. When she was in high school, her mother took her to meet Harlem Renaissance poets Langston Hughes and James Weldon Johnson, who encouraged her interests. Next heading, dedication and recognition. By the time she was 16, Brooks had published approximately 75 poems in local publications. Read that line again and be impressed. By the time she was 16, a little bit younger than most of you guys, Brooks had published approximately 75 poems in local publications. She continued to study, write, and hone her craft. Her first book of poetry garnered critical acclaim. With the publication of her second book, Annie Allen, in 1950, she became the first African-American writer to win a Pulitzer Prize. Wow, so you want to write that down. Honors and prizes followed throughout her career. Final heading, a new generation. Inspired by the civil rights movement of the 1960s and its new generation of young black activists and artists, Brooks' works became increasingly political and experimental. As noted author Tony Cade Bambara remarked in the New York Times Book Review, Brooks' later works were marked by, quote, a new movement and energy, intensity, richness, power of statement, and a new stripped, lean, compressed style. A change of style prompted by a change of mind, end quote. By the time of her death, at the turn of the 21st century, Brooks had become one of the most highly regarded poets of our time. Let's jump to 2B and the literary analysis information to help us get ready to read The Explorer. Writers, including poets, use various rhetorical devices. Of course, we know this word rhetorical because that's our 2B word, right? To emphasize messages or invoke emotions in their readers. Repetition and parallelism are two devices that often appear in poetry. Let's get them both in our notes. Let's make sure we understand them. Repetition, I think this one's a little easier for us. Repeating of key words or concepts. We griefs, grand griefs, and choices. He feared most of all the choices. You can see the repetition of the word griefs and choices. Parallelism, let's write this one at 2B. Parallelism is the presentation of similar ideas using the same grammatical structures. Your example, when it is finally ours. When it belongs at last to all. When it is truly instinct. Notice the repetition of when it. We call this parallelism. So notice there's some proximity, some similarities between the two ideas. In the first example above, the repetition of griefs and choices helps communicate the idea that one's grief is related to one's choices. In the second example, the repetition of the grammatical structure, when it, builds a sense of urgency and expectation. Finally, comparing literary works. As you read these poems, find examples, and by the way, we're talking now about both Gwendolyn Brooks' Explorer as well as Robert Hayden's Frederick Douglass, which will be the work that we turn to next after this one. As you read these poems, find examples of repetition and parallelism. Consider the specific purposes, emphasis, or emotion these devices help each poet achieve. Finally, your reading strategy is to read the poems aloud to give these poems your full attention and aid your comprehension. When you encounter repetition, slow down and emphasize it. Listen for the poet's use of repetition, parallelism, and other literary elements in these poems. You can use the chart like the one that's provided there to you on 1062. By the way, do notice that you got 3 vocab words as well that you want to pay attention to. All right, let's turn now to Gwendolyn Brooks' The Explorer. At level 1, we simply want to identify or write down a person identified here as only he explores an apartment building searching for a still spot in the noise. His search for peace, his inner peace, is unsuccessful, however, as all he finds are noises connected with human activities and the frightening prospect of choices that cried to be taken. Now, we're going to have a literal reading and then a metaphoric reading of this poem. So let's start at level 1. We'll just simply write down what happens in this poem, The Explorer. Let's read it together. Gwendolyn Brooks.
The Explorer by Gwendolyn Brooks. Somehow to find a still spot in the noise was the frayed inner want, the winding, the frayed hope, whose tatters he kept hunting through the den. A satin piece somewhere, a room of wily hush somewhere within. So tipping down the scrambled halls, he set vague hands on throbbing knobs. There were behind only spiraling, high human voices. The scream of nervous affairs, wee griefs, grand griefs, and choices. He feared most of all the choices that cried to be taken. There were no bournes. There were no quiet rooms.
All right, so let's pause now and pay attention to the way we want to read this poem. It's a really brilliant little poem, so let's take a look at it. Let's start at 2B, as we often like to do, in the structure of the poem. Identify quickly. You've got 5 lines of a first stanza, and then do you see it? You got a break there. Do you see it? And then you've got a second stanza that will end with "and choices." Then you've got a 1-line stanza, he feared most of all the choices, and then you've got a final a rhymed couplet. The idea of bournes versus rooms, it's a kind of slant rhyme, but rhyme nonetheless for us. So let's take a look now at the poem itself, and let's try and figure out what actually is going on at level 1. Then we'll ask what it means at level 2A. Somehow, notice the title, The Explorer. And of course, to explore, jot down at level 1, what does that even mean to you? If a person is an explorer, what does he or she do? Jot it down. Some have said, to be an explorer, you have to go on a journey. You have to discover something. That's what exploration is all about. Of course, the journey can be physical. We can think about Odysseus and his journey. We can think about Aeneas and his journey. I'm mentioning now, obviously, some 3A observations. Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid. We can think about Dante and his journey in the Divine Comedy, right? All of those are examples of journeys that are quite literally journeys, or we can think about metaphoric journeys, the journey within. Right? Let's take a look. Somehow, to find a still spot in the noise was the frayed inner want. Frayed here, of course, meaning torn up, tattered. The winding, the frayed, notice the repetition already, we've seen it of frayed. The frayed hope, whose tatters he kept hunting through the den, noise. A satin piece somewhere, a room of wily hush somewhere within. Now let's pause for a moment. Put it at level 1. Now you ought to be able to, as juniors, to begin to read this stuff and just put it in your own words. What exactly is it that he wanted to find? Write it down. Can you put it in your own words? What is it that he wanted to find? And there it is, of course, in the first line. A still spot in the noise. A satin piece somewhere. A room of wily hush somewhere. In other words, you could put this at level 1 as simply, we got a person who is looking for a quiet place. A still place, a quiet place. Now, of course, the last word of line 5 we're going to have to jot down, because the suggestion is that this quiet place is going to be a room not physically, but within. Within. So this poem is brilliant because it can be read as an individual going in search of a quiet spot physically, geographically, physically, or looking for a quiet spot within. From here on out now, the brilliance of this poem, because of the word within, is that it can be read both literally, as if quite literally someone is walking through an apartment looking for a quiet room because there's all this noise going around everywhere, or it can be the mind, and more particularly the halls of the mind, the rooms of the mind. In other words, if I could just keep a lot of my thoughts quiet long enough so that I could do some exploration of my own thoughts. Let's read the second stanza. So, tipping down the scrambled halls, he set vague hands on throbbing knobs. You notice the repetition of sounds here, halls, knobs. In other words, he's walking through that hall and he's reaching out for knobs on doors. There were behind only spiraling high human voices, the scream of nervous affairs, wee griefs, grand griefs, and choices. In other words, as he's walking down the hall, he can hear behind the doors, he can hear human voices. Some of those human voices are engaged in silly things, silly griefs, that's wee griefs, and some are engaged in major issues. And of course, there's always the question of choices that one must make as one walks down the hall with all these doors. I once had a student, just a 3A observation. I once had a student who was a huge Matrix fan, if you know the movies, The Matrix. And the minute that he read this, he said, this is like that scene where there's that long hall, and there's all those doors all the way down, and you're kind of walking, and should I reach out and open this? So quite literally at level 1, let's just write it down. He's trying to figure out which room it is that he should go into. What is he looking for? A room where there's some kind of quietness. Of course, the problem is he's got multiple rooms, which means he has, let's go to the next line, choices. He feared most of all the choices that cried to be taken. And if you've already written down at 3A that famous Frost poem about two paths diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. If you're familiar with that idea, we've already read Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, the Robert Frost offering as well. It's difficult to not hear some of Frost echoing, if you can pardon the pun, given that we're talking about noises from behind doors, echoing through this poem. But notice, we're told that the thing he feared most were all the choices that cried to be taken. Why? That's going to be a 3B question we're going to ask. Why is it so hard to have multiple choices? Well, we'll come to that one as we get to 3B in a moment. Final couple of lines. There were no bournes, that is to say, no limits, no boundaries. There were no quiet rooms. And then that's the end of the poem. How do you, at level 1, how do you summarize the last 2 lines? There were no bournes, no limits, no boundaries. There were no quiet rooms. Lots of people have pointed out, this poem suggests that life is full of lots and lots of choices. And there's no easy choices because every choice leads to another choice. Every room leads to another room. It's a powerful word picture of what growing up and growing older is all about. Let's jump to 2A really quickly. Messages, themes. Some people have said that the whole key of this poem is in its title, The Explorer. Some have said that you need to call this poem The Wanderer as much as The Explorer, because it's not clear if anything is actually discovered other than the potentialities of discovery, all of these potential rooms. Another major message or theme. With every choice comes new choices. With every decision, new indecisions. There are no quiet rooms. The challenge of life is to continue to make the next choice. We will ask at 3B if it's true. If you think it's true, you are your choices. It's a fascinating way to look at your life. We'll come back to it at 3B. Another major message. Notice all of the fatigue words at the beginning of the poem. Frayed, inner want. Frayed hope. The hope for some kind of peace somewhere. This poem seems to suggest that peace, as Yeats will say it in Lake Isle of Innisfree, comes passing slow. You don't get a lot of peace in this life. Have you noticed that as you're getting older, there seems to be more stress, not less stress? As you're getting older, there seems to be less peace, not more peace. Why is that? Why is that? Why can't life just be nice, calm? Why is it that there has to be so much crazy drama in our life? Do you have a sense that that's going to become less as you get older or more as you get older? Talk to any of the adults in your life and they will tell you, no, it gets way worse as you get older. Sorry, hate to break it to you, but that's just the way that it is. Of course, at 2B, we've got all kinds of fascinating things we can point out here. We were beginning by concentrating on this notion of repetition, and you see it there, the idea of frayed inner want, frayed hope, this repetition for emphasizing. Of course, you have all kinds of wonderful sound games being played as well as the repetition. We, griefs, grand griefs, and choices, all the S sounds. Of course, the word picture here is the big one at 2B, isn't it? Wow, what a compelling metaphor. Your life is like walking down halls, a long hall, with all these doors that have knobs. And of course, the challenge is to reach out and take hold of the knob, open it. But of course, the minute you step into a room and shut the door, you now are no longer in the hall. You no longer have all of the other choices available to you. But then you look up and you say, I'm in a room with 2 doors. Which one do I take? And you open one of the doors and you go into another room with now 3 more doors in different parts of that room. And now you're for sure no longer in the hall. Knowing this, when you're standing in the hall, leads you to question about choices. It's a compelling word picture, right? How do I know if I'm making the right choices? What if I make a choice and it's the wrong choice? What do I do then? Because once you're in the room, you turn around to go out of the door, and the door is locked. You can't. Dilemma of all dilemmas. At 3A, we can think about any number of titles. I've already mentioned so many of these classic texts. Let's mention Jean-Paul Sartre's classic No Exit, a famous little play where 3 people are on stage in a living room. It's really nice. 1 man, 2 women. It takes them all 3 just a few minutes to realize they're dead. They're dead. A few moments ago they were alive. Now they're dead. This is afterlife. And they all look around and they kind of go, well, this isn't bad. They've done things that they should be in hell for. All 3 of them. But they look around and they go, dude, this isn't a bad room. And the guy looks around and he goes, this is my afterlife? I'm a guy with 2 girls in a room? Sweet. The girls immediately, however, start back and forth fighting. And he's like, oh no, this is going to drive me nuts if I got to do this forever and forever. And then he sees the door. And then he goes to the door. The door is unlocked. And he opens it. And he looks out. And it's a hallway going into darkness in both directions. Question. Do you stay in the room? Or do you walk out in the hall? No Exit's the name of the play. I highly recommend it to you. Think of other titles that for you play the game of choices. What is for you your favorite song about choices? On your playlist, we've talked about this regularly, on your playlist, what is the song for you that is the great song of exploration? I'm thinking as well of T.S. Eliot's classic and 4 quartets line, old men should be explorers. It is a fascinating question to ask. Why is it the case so regularly that as people get older and choices have been made, they oftentimes will feel limited by their choices? Like they can't make any more choices. I'm always fascinated by students who I have who are like this, who will say, I can't go to college because I'm not very good at, and then they fill in the blank. Which it seems to me is counterintuitive. If you're not very good at blank, fill in the blank, isn't that why you'd want to go to college? Or the student, for example, who comes in my room and says, Mr. McGee, I hate to read. And I say, oh great, here's a book. No, no, you didn't hear me. I really hate to read. Oh, well then here's 2 books. If you're not good at something, why wouldn't you challenge yourself to become good at it? To at least become better at it? Choices. Let's jump to 3b, and you can already see where this text is going to be taking us. What are your views of choices? Do you fear most of all choices that cry out to be taken? What's the hardest thing about choices? Of course, let's say it out loud. Choices in this poem can also mean our word goals, right? Goals. You can have short-term goals, you can have long-term goals. What's the problem with goals? We know what the advantages are with goals. You set a goal, you meet the goal, you can pat yourself on the back and say, did it. Yes. You will feel that way the day you graduate, won't you? You're sitting there in your chair, you walk across the track, the balloons go up, the mascara runs, and you're able to say to yourself, I started, I finished. Did it. But there's the other question. What about all the choices that were not made? That is to say regrets, yes? The regrets. How do you live a life without regrets? Because for every choice you make, there's a million choices you didn't make. For every friend that you decided to be a friend of, there's a whole bunch of other people you didn't choose to have as your friend. I wonder what it would have been. This is the observation here. The problem is always self-doubt. The penultimate example of this, and you can write it in 3a, is of course Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy, which ends with, thus conscience makes cowards of us all. We have this tendency, because there's so many choices, to make no choices. Students who are exceptionally gifted and bright, they understand what I'm about to say. Sometimes talent is a curse, not a blessing. If you're really good at a lot of stuff, it's sometimes really hard to make choices and decisions.